How we doing?
Doing all right.
Welcome. So the next topic on our agenda is we're looking at this tax capacity presentation. And we have this gentleman who I should know, but I don't. And maybe if you'll introduce yourself and tell us where we're at.
Yeah. My name is Nick Kelch. I'm the director of the Wyoming Center for Business and Economic Analysis at LCCC.
You might pull that microphone a little closer to you. I can
I'm
hear
Nick
you fine, but-
Kelch, the director of the Wyoming Center for Business and Economic Analysis at LCCC. I'm also an economics and public policy instructor at the college. And I worked on a tax capacity report based on the LSO report that was released earlier with Joe Schaefer. And that's what I'm here to talk about.
Well, it's all yours and welcome. Thank you.
So do you have the slideshow up? I just want to make sure that.
Beth, can we get the slideshow? It's coming up. So, Mr. All right, and say your last name again.
Kelch. Yep.
Kelch. Okay, I would be bound to mess that up.
Don't worry about it. Everybody does.
Well, I worry. So, Mr. Kelch, it's yours.
Yeah. So if we go to the first slide, the reason we're looking at tax capacity in Wyoming is the fact that the state does rely on natural resources, and as of late, natural resource prices have been plummeting. Oil futures hit a negative price in April of last year. And so we have to look at other ways to generate revenue to fill in the gap from falling revenues from natural resources. So there are two ways we can do this. We can either raise existing taxes, such as state sales tax and property taxes, or we implement brand new taxes to Wyoming, which I think everybody in this room would probably oppose. Right? So our questions are basically asking, A, is there capacity in Wyoming based on the tax rates in other states to raise taxes so that Wyoming doesn't become or lose its competitive edge? And second, is there capacity within Wyoming citizens to bear the addition of new taxes? Go to the next slide.
So, and just by way of some housekeeping for the committee, we have the entire report in our committee.
Oh,
Pro-
lovely.
And so after you've read that, but you can find this presentation at the end of that report. Skip forward.
Okay.
It's actually page 115 of your handouts.
Right. So what we did is we looked at the original LSO report. And the LSO report compares Wyoming to the states surrounding it plus North Dakota. And then it estimates what the additional tax revenue generated would be if Wyoming were to raise its taxes to the median of the surrounding states and North Dakota. The problem we had with this original report, I shouldn't say problem, is that Wyoming doesn't have personal income tax and it doesn't have corporate income tax. 6 of the 7 states that surround Wyoming do. And so comparing Wyoming to states that have these additional taxes that Wyoming doesn't didn't make a lot of sense. So what we did instead is we also compared Wyoming to other states that didn't have personal income tax and or didn't have corporate income tax. There are 8 states that don't have personal income tax and 4 that don't have personal income tax nor corporate income tax. Those 4 are Texas, Washington, South Dakota, and Nevada. And then we also looked at the capacity from the taxpayer side. So comparing incomes and the cost of living in Wyoming to our comparator states. Okay. If we want to move to the next slide. So this is the original LSO report. It highlights the median rates for the surrounding states, and then it estimates the additional revenue generated if we were to move to the median of the surrounding states. I believe it's $800 million per year. And then we moved on to our report. So we can skip past this because I've already talked about it a little bit. Basically, we have 8 new comparison states and 4 that we're going to look more closely at. So we've already touched on this too. So if you can move ahead, that'd be great. So this is the original work that you've done. So the LSO report only compared at the median. We also compared to the mean. And we also compared if Wyoming were to go full socialist and raise it to the maximum rate available in all the surrounding states. So it gave a bit of a broader perspective. Slide, please. And then we looked at Wyoming compared to other no personal income tax states. And as you can see, in all of these tax rates, there is capacity for Wyoming to increase its taxes. If we look at the median, mean, or max. Move on. And then these are the 4 states we want to most compare to, because these are the 4 states with the tax structure most similar to Wyoming. And even within these 4 states, you can see that if Wyoming were to raise its taxes to the median or mean, it has the capacity to do so. So Wyoming's existing taxes lie below the median and mean for these comparator groups. Next slide, please. Okay. So now we're looking at earnings in Wyoming compared to surrounding states. If we look at just median income, Wyoming only sits behind Colorado and Utah. If we look at mean income, it sits behind Colorado and North Dakota. So Wyoming's incomes on average are higher than in surrounding states, right? It sits in the upper half of the surrounding state region. And if you look at the cost of living index for Wyoming, it's 95.4, which is lower than every state except for Nebraska. Nebraska and Idaho, I guess. So we have a rather low cost of living, and we have higher incomes. So if we use the original comparison group, it appears that on the citizen side, we do have some capacity to raise taxes and put some tax burden on the citizens of Wyoming. So if we compare to other states that don't have personal income tax, there are 8 states. And if you look at it, our incomes compare pretty well. We sit behind Washington and Alaska in terms of median household income. And we have a much lower cost of living than most of those states, with the exception of Texas and Tennessee. So again, comparing apples to apples in states with the same tax structures, we still have that capacity on the citizen side due to our high incomes and relatively low cost of living. Next slide, please. If we look at just the 4 states that don't have income tax nor corporate income tax, you can see our cost of living is lower than every state except for Texas, and our wages are higher than every other state except for Washington, I believe. And I guess, yeah, about it. You can move to the next slide if you'd like. These are just more graphs showing the same thing I've been talking about. So there's basically Wyoming's taxes. No matter which tax you look at, we're sitting below the median and the mean for all our comparator groups. And you can see that on these bar graphs. Wyoming is the brown bar because, you know, school pride, I guess. You can move to the next slide if you'd like. If we look at the taxes of surrounding states, the same idea holds. Wyoming has rather low taxes when comparing into either group, either tax or groups that have income taxes, groups that don't have income taxes, groups in the same region. Wyoming has very low taxes, and that's why it's ranked number 1 according to the tax report. So, okay. If we look at states that don't have personal income tax nor corporate income tax, you can see that Wyoming still has capacity there. It has the second lowest fuel tax rate. It has very low property taxes, has rather low sales tax rate. In fact, I believe it's the lowest in the group by at least 1 percentage point. And then we looked at, so here are earnings. Again, Wyoming compares very favorably. We don't have really high wages like Washington does, but we do have higher than average wages when compared to South Dakota and Nevada. Cost of living, we're lower than every other state except for Texas. So then we looked at if we were to raise our taxes to the median of the group that doesn't have personal income tax or corporate income tax. So we don't have to worry about raising a new personal income tax or corporate income tax. And if we were to do that, we would generate about $2.3 billion biannually by going to the median of all states that don't have income tax nor corporate income tax. Next slide, please. So then we started looking at the 2 states that are most like Wyoming. We decided that Washington's wages were much higher, and so it isn't a fair comparison. Texas has 5 major metropolitan areas, so that's not a fair comparison either. So we looked at South Dakota and Nevada. South Dakota, again, borders us, heavily reliant on natural resources and tourism. And if we were to implement South Dakota's tax structure, and South Dakota ranks number 2 right behind Wyoming, we would generate about $1.1 billion annually or $2.2 billion biannually. We look at Nevada.
Okay, okay, take questions as we go along.
Sure.
Okay, Representative Gray.
So the South Dakota comparison is very interesting in a way because in 2019, Wyoming had the 7th, and we have similar populations, right? I mean, South Dakota's a little more,
Right.
But our scale's similar, right? I mean, there's
Right.
South Dakota's a rural state, right? I mean, they have some more scale than we do in Sioux Falls, Rapid by a little bit. But South Dakota has the 47th highest per capita tax income. The total per capita tax dollar amount. And Wyoming in 2019 had number 7. And that was a bad year. So, I mean, usually Wyoming's at number 3. So, I mean, I'm not, I mean, the bottom line, you can say that South Dakota has minerals, but in reality, they don't have it to the extent that Wyoming does. And that's the flaw in the premise. And I'm just the premise of this entire tax capacity concept, in my opinion. And so I just want to ask you, I mean, do you have any response to that? Because you're comparing apples and oranges, in my opinion, states that don't have the minerals as much as we do. And that's something that God has blessed us with. So we can't just ignore all that income, I don't think. So do you have any response to that? Because I mean, at the end of the day, comparing states with similar populations for the scale question is, and their per capita incomes, revenues into government is really, I think, the question. And Wyoming's number 7 and South Dakota is 47. So I guess I open that up. You know, I'm just, what's your response to that?
Go ahead, Mr. Kelsch.
Yeah. So at the tax capacity analysis, I mean, all we're looking at is basically, is there a gap between the sales tax or any other taxes that Wyoming implements on its citizens compared to South Dakota's? And what we're showing is there is, right? So there's the ability to raise taxes in Wyoming and actually not even match South Dakota. So we're not going to lose our ranking in terms of tax favorability against South Dakota. And that's kind of what the capacity analysis was about. We have higher incomes than South Dakota does. So there is some ability for Wyoming citizens to bear some of these additional taxes if they were to be implemented. And the state already has rates set below. So we're not looking at the total amount that South Dakota is going to end up paying for its citizens. I mean, its citizens pay higher sales taxes, they pay higher property taxes, and that's what we're showing. But in terms of total tax package, because they also don't have personal income tax nor corporate income tax, they're a comparable state to Wyoming. That's why we felt comparison to South Dakota and Nevada, the same reason, are pretty favorable. Right? No state is really in a mineral position like Wyoming is, other than maybe Alaska. Even then, they're probably better off than we are. So.
Do you want to follow up?
Okay.
You know, I just might add that we're looking at this statically right now. I can't disagree that we have more tax revenues per person than probably anywhere because of this wonderful bounty of minerals. But the question is, I think, is where are we going? And we're well on this trip. We're well on this trip for the past 10 years. We're very much well on this trip for the past 5 years that we're losing that mineral base. And with global warming, concerns about CO2, it's not going to come back. So we better figure out where we're going and how we're going to get there. And I think that's why this analysis is a good analysis. Representative Baker.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I appreciate the presentation. I just have a question regarding the different property taxes. And I understand that the original LSO property didn't, or original LSO report didn't address ag at all, but we've discussed it here and it's 93% of our tax classification. Can you comment on how we relate to other states in our ag evaluation?
That's one thing we didn't do in the report. So I would have to go back and research that. So that's a great thing to look at since the state is very, very rural.
Okay, thank you. Anybody else? Representative Henderson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank you, sir, for coming up. I understand Cheyenne has a foot of snow.
It's getting there. Yeah.
My question has to do with the possibility of incorporating South Dakota's rates. Which, if that were done based on your analysis, what 2 or 3 would make the biggest difference for Wyoming? Looking forward, like the chairman just spoke of, in terms of what we can do now to have a multiplier effect in significant ways, 10, 14 years down the road.
Right.
ahead,
So,
Mr. Kelsey.
oh, sorry.
It's okay.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Oh, based on our report, sorry, South Dakota's still up there. You're going to generate most of the money off of property taxes. South Dakota's sales tax rate is only 1 percentage point higher on average throughout the state. And so there's not as much capacity there to generate money. So raising property taxes, because Wyoming has some of the lowest in the entire country, would be the way to do it. In fact, one of the reasons we didn't compare to Texas is because Texas has some of the highest property tax rates in the entire country. So property taxes would likely be the best route for generating money because it's on assets that are already here. So,
Anybody else? You good? Please continue.
so we not only looked at South Dakota, but we
Mr.
also
Chairman.
looked at Nevada. And Nevada had, I believe it was ranked 7th in terms of the
Mr.
tax
Chairman.
reports analysis. Sometimes it's ranked 3rd. It just depends on what the other 5 states are doing around it. As you see, if we were to implement or emulate Nevada's
Mr.
tax rates,
Chairman.
we would generate about $1.1 to $1.15 billion annually, or about $2.3 billion biannually. So the big takeaways are on the next slide. Basically, from our analysis, if you compare to surrounding states, there is capacity because Wyoming's tax rates are lower. If you compare to other states that don't implement personal income taxes, Wyoming's rates are lower. If you compare to other states that don't have personal income nor corporate income taxes, Wyoming's rates are lower. And Wyoming has rather high incomes in these comparison groups, often ranking 3rd or 2nd. And it has a rather low cost of living, with a cost of living index sitting below 100, which is below average for the nation. So in our view, there is capacity for Wyoming citizens to bear higher tax burdens. Okay. I guess there are more. Oh, there's one last slide where you can ask questions, but of course you've been asking questions already, so keep going.
They're not very shy about questions.
Yeah.
Any questions at this point? How about online? Senator James.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I do have a couple of questions. So did you look at, when it came to the earnings, did you look at
There's a feedback. I think it wants.
when it came to the earnings, did you look at private versus public?
Can you elaborate, Senator James? What do you mean by?
What the private sector made versus the public sector?
Oh,
When it came to
no,
the
we did
earnings.
not parse out incomes based on where people were working, either the public sector or private sector. We only looked at household income.
Okay, well, when it comes to Wyoming, the number one employer in Wyoming is the government. So I think that'd be very important to look at. Did you also look at the government size in these states that you were comparing Wyoming to?
Yeah, so we did not compare the number of jobs as a function of the overall economic makeup of these states. We compared based mostly on population, natural resources given, and the tax structure as it currently stands.
Follow up, Mr. Chairman. So when it comes to the taxes and everything that, and how we determine if we're going to add new taxes go to the government. So before we decide whether or not we're going to raise taxes, we should probably cut where the expenses are going, where the taxes are going. So we should probably cut government before we start raising taxes. And since we have such a massive government here in Wyoming, we should probably look at that first. So that's one thing you should be looking at, is the government size when you start comparing other states.
That's fair, I
All
guess.
right, well,
I'm not-
appreciate
I'm not
that.
sure.
And that is a conundrum in Wyoming, certainly. And like Fremont County has the second most government employees in the state of Wyoming. We have a tremendous amount of federal employees, as well as state. And 2/3 of our state's owned by the federal government. We have a lot of federal employees in this state as well. So when you look at all those government numbers, those certainly include. Then we're kind of unique. We have county public hospitals, almost all of them except for a few. Natrona County now is sold out, but those are all counted in those numbers as public employees. So there's always more to the story. And I agree, as a frontier state, Senator James, I hear you. We have some diseconomy of scales, and we still have prisons and schools and a university, but so it's going to always look tough. There's no doubt. We have
Right.
most expensive prisoners, most expensive roads per mile, most expensive college kids, university kids, Medicaid patients, elderly, you name it, per capita. There's no doubt. And it's tough, but I think the good chairman of revenue or director of the Department of Revenue mentioned it. We all want those services. I think this town we're in right now is fighting over this hospital issue. And so it's tough, and we just got to keep working on it, moving forward. And so we're going to kind of wrap this, unless there's any other questions here or in the room. Go ahead, Representative Gray.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Schaefer, I do appreciate you being here. I may not agree with the premise of this, but I appreciate your perspective and coming in. So I have one other question for you on the sales tax rates. What do other states do surrounding us on optional sales taxes locally? I mean, in general, are they going with that approach, or is it usually a state share and divvying it up to other localities? Did you look at that at all?
I have not looked at that, but I can. Yeah.
Sure. Okay, and there's probably folks in the room who can maybe help us with that too, Director. Okay, any questions in the room then? Anyone here? Any comments? Well, Mr. Kelsey, this is, this whole thing, and you just hit the highlights of it. As I read through this thing over the weekend, it's really an incredible piece of work, and really appreciate your work. And I think I talked to our LSO staff, we continue to update these things. You've laid the foundation now, and we'll just continue this update and this learning process. But
yeah,
certainly we've been blessed in Wyoming, minerals have paid a big share of it for us. So any questions for Mr. Kels? Okay, are you heading back home then today?
probably.
Okay, well, drive careful. We appreciate your
Thank
your
you very
good
much.
work.
Thanks for having me. And, if you have any questions, feel free to contact me.
Yeah, that's great. We appreciate you. Okay, thank you. Hey, members, next, we have a presentation from the county commissioners, and that's been handed out to you. And we're going to take it right now on this county municipal tax structure. Really, I think what Representative Gray just asked, and we'll kind of continue on with that a little bit. Go ahead, gentlemen, introduce yourselves.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. I'm Jeremiah Riemann here on behalf of the County Commissioners Association.
And David Fraser, Executive Director, Wyoming Association of Municipalities. Thank you for having us, Mr. Chairman.
got your hand out. The problem with these mics, you can't see that little red thing. It's hid behind the. Okay.
Well, thanks, Mr. Chairman. We thought it might be beneficial to the group as you're talking about the state's tax structure to take a little bit of a dive into the local tax structure. There's much that has been discussed today. I'll perhaps hit on some pieces that dovetail with that and then perhaps introduce some other points. Mr. Chairman did put out a handout. I'm not going to go through every single one of the slides and certainly happy to have it put up. Mr. Chairman, on page 3, I've included just a link to a document that we put out to the counties every April to help them understand and estimate some of the various tax sources. So if you want to dive further into anything that I talk about here, that is a really good resource. And of course, I'm happy to provide information. Mr. Chairman, diving into those revenue streams, first I'm going to talk about property taxes. And it's certainly been a major portion of the conversation today, but I think there's some pieces that we can add to that conversation. I'm on slide 6 now. Property taxes are generally the largest revenue source for local governments in counties. At current, the average county mill levy is 11.788. Now, just quickly, all but 2 counties in Wyoming assess the full 12 mills. Those 2 that do not are Campbell, which assesses 11.276, and Teton, which assesses 7.879. And both of those just happen to be recapture counties. So even with that lower mill levy for Teton County, it is a recapture district. The average mill levy for municipalities is 7.525 mills. And I'll talk a little bit more about that here in just a second. Mr. Chairman, you mentioned the average total of mills across the state, and it is currently right around 69 mills. And that can go up and down, of course, by taxing district. Mr. Chairman, on page 7 of the handout, the approximate total revenue intake is 1.46 billion. You did see another slide, I think, in the Department of Revenue handout that showed the approximate percentages of distribution. Those numbers are slightly different than this. I think my information is 2020, that was 2019. But nonetheless, the information is generally consistent. Schools and education take in 72.55% of all property tax, county government at 17.65%, special district 7.76%, and municipalities 2.04%. I did want to hit on that municipality piece because there was some conversation about why is that so low. And I was conversing with Representative Gray. You'll remember, generally, there isn't mineral development within municipalities. And so they wouldn't benefit from that levy as a percentage of their take in the assessment. So that's why they are a lower percentage by mill, if you will. Mr. Chairman, moving over to page 8, and I think this is really important information. And I have a couple of slides like this in the presentation. And those are, I'm trying to show you the general distribution of property tax. And really what these 2 slides will highlight is you can't simply make a change to one tax piece and assume that that's going to have an equal effect across all of our taxing jurisdictions. It just simply won't. So the first one here on page 8, the tier 1, and call it whatever you want. I'm just trying to show you that the top 7 counties in this state in terms of property tax assessment collect 73%. That means the other 16 counties are collecting 27% of the property tax in this state. So you simply can't make a change there. And remember, we have 2 counties that aren't collecting the full of their mills. So were they, the disparity would be that much greater in this particular slide. I'll also just point out those so-called tier 3 counties, with the exception of Johnson County. Those are your counties in the Madden formula that are incapable of generating $300,000 per mill. So those are sort of the hardship counties in the Madden formula. Moving on from that particular slide, Mr. Chairman, to slide 9 is just a comparison of the assessed valuation across counties from tax year 2019 to 2020. And you can see in that data from the State Board of Equalization, our assessed valuation in the state has dropped by $321 million. I want to dig just a little bit further into that in the next 2 slides. I'm going to draw your attention to 2 data sets here in particular. If you look at the assessed valuation for residential property in 2019, the percentage of the overall whole is 16.63%. And if you slide over at the bottom of that table to minerals, the total for them is 64.12%. Now that's again 2019. Mr. Chairman, if you turn to page 11 and look at those same figures, residential as a part of the whole has risen by 10.85% to the 27.48%. And minerals in just that one tax year in comparison to the whole has dropped by 17%. So minerals dropped $750 million in the overall assessment, but all of the other categories do rise. Ag land's up 4.6 million, residential 317 million, commercial 23.3 million, and industrial 83.7. So you can see, as you all have in a number of other slides, the conundrum that we're facing currently with minerals as a portion of our property tax. Mr. Chairman, moving from property tax into sales and use tax, we don't need to go into this in great depth. You all know the statewide 4%, the state share being 69 plus 1, the county being 31 minus 1. So that's the 1% that we pay to the state for administration. And then, of course, you see how it's distributed at the bottom of that. Page 14 just shows a general comparison of the gross revenue by county. Mr. Chairman, slide 15 again shows the tiering. And in this scenario, the top 7 counties collect 66% of all sales and use tax in the state of Wyoming. So again, can't just turn one lever and assume that that's going to have an impact on all counties. Mr. Chairman, I did want to give an update on the local side of the sales and use tax scenario here. That's on slide 16. I have in there the so-called 5th, 6th, and 7th pennies. The reason I do that is you can have 2 general purpose pennies, but so many people call that the 5th penny. You could have 2 specific purpose pennies, but that, a lot of people call that the 6th penny. And then of course you have up to 1 economic development penny. Of course, you can have no more than a total of 7. In our history, no county has ever gone past 6 pennies. In fact, Teton County this year rejected going to a 7th, at the end of last year, rejected going to a 7th. Currently, there are 21 of 23 counties that do assess a general purpose. The next bullet point there, 15 of 23, have a specific purpose. Of course, that comes and goes depending on collections, and it has changed a little bit. And we now have 2 counties that collect an economic development penny. Goshen County has collected a fractional portion of a penny for a number of years. And just last year, voters approved Fremont County to go to a 1/2 cent economic development penny, which just went into place, I believe, in March. So that's now in place. And then, of course, at the bottom, you all have authorized municipalities under certain circumstances to propose an optional municipal tax. Dave's going to correct me if I'm wrong, but I do not believe that no municipality has done that quite yet.
Correct.
Mr. Chairman, moving from sales and use tax to severance tax, I just provide some quick data in terms of the sharing that happens there. Both the counties and municipalities do share in that severance tax under the $155 million cap. And then counties do get, both of them get a portion that go to their general funds. And then the county also receives some that go to its county road construction and maintenance fund. Mr. Chairman, moving to direct distribution and over to slide on page 20, just showing quickly discretionary funds, direct distribution. I've included the 3 lines there because it was only 4 biennia ago that the state not only shared a much larger portion of direct distribution, but also shared consensus funding and other supplemental grants that we could go to the state board for. Over time, of course, that's been reduced to the 105 and those other 2 to 0. And I've included the current distribution between counties and municipalities at the bottom of that slide. Mr. Chairman, moving over to fuel tax and slide 22. Of course, I've just shared a little bit about the fuel tax, both gas and diesel, which is shared with municipalities and counties. And I don't know the municipal percentage, but 2/3 of all roads in the state of Wyoming, whether they're gravel or paved, are owned and managed by counties. So we have considerable needs. In fact, I think you'd talk to a commissioner, the topic that they hear most from their constituents about is roads, and particularly this time of year. Mr. Chairman, just a few other areas where local governments receive some revenue from, and I've included those in the chart there. And moving over to page 24, payments in lieu of taxes. This is a federal program that is intended to offset property taxes of non-federal lands in counties. And I'll just point one out. Let's look at Sublette County. 80% of the land in Sublette County is federal land, and they get just under $100 million in contributions. Significantly undervalued. I think we would all agree, and that would be the same for all of the rest of those counties that are listed there. Mr. Chairman, moving to slide 25, I've included automobile registration numbers. I'm not going to go into the details there, but you can see that. And the distribution is very much like property taxes. So counties may collect that money, but most of it's distributed back to, in particular, schools. Mr. Chairman, on slides 27 and 28, we've included some other sharing that does happen. We have, of course, the Wyoming Lottery, which had been growing, and then we saw a little bit of a change in terms of administrative structure, something we supported, and that has dropped the amount of revenue that has come back, but we do expect that over time that will come back up. You also have pari-mutuel and skill games is the most recent piece of the equation that's shown on page 27. And then moving over to 28 are just some other taxes that are shared, and I've included some of the revenues that are generated from those, whether that's nicotine taxes. That's obviously the change from just a pure cigarette tax to the more broadened nicotine approach that we have now. I've included 911 fees, wind generation, which is shared back to the county, franchise and enterprise funds, which go to municipalities. And then there are some smaller other elements that are included there. Mr. Chairman, that's really what I wanted to do in terms of a brief introduction. Mr. Frazier is here as well, and we're happy to answer questions.
Okay, thank you, gentlemen. Any questions? Representative Baker.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Can you talk briefly about the special districts with related to ambulances and ambulance services?
Mr. Chairman, I don't know a whole lot about that particular area. It is something that, of course, a number of my counties are becoming rather interested in and looking at whether they can pursue special districts for ambulance services. If you go into the special district titles, it does allow for that particular approach, assuming the voters want to approve it. And a number of our counties are looking at that. Mr. Chairman, I would also point to the legislation that you all passed this last session to take an assessment on ambulance services. That is something that my counties are rather interested and favorable to, and think it could help them. Fremont County obviously is one of those areas where they're pressed. I know in your district, there's a lot of concern. I've heard from Albany County. Again, I don't have a whole lot that I can share there, but I am becoming more attuned to it as my members reach out.
Okay, any follow-up there? Okay, thank you. Any other questions, members? Hey, just a question, really, two questions. The first is kind of this severance tax and FMR below the cap, city, county, CapCon, road fund. I mean, when I think of CapCon, I think, these are one-time type projects, but this is an ongoing stream that, goes back to the turn of the century when this de-earmarking took place. It's like I'm looking at FMR 7 million to cities, towns, and county CapCon. I mean, divide that out by everybody. What's everybody get? $20,000 or what? You know what I mean? It's just, it can't be much.
Mr. Chairman, the ultimate distribution, I don't have it immediately in front of me, but you're right. It is small in the larger scheme of things. It is an ongoing revenue source, but the statutory structure as well as the constitutional structure require it to be one-time projects. You can't go purchase, generally you can't purchase equipment. You can lease equipment, and generally you're to spend that money through contractors. So there are some limitations. In fact, we're looking at that with a working group this summer and having conversations with the Joint Transportation Committee about whether there might be some additional flexibility afforded. But you're right. The amounts of money going into these county road funds are not that significant for, the costs that are borne out amongst the jurisdiction and the amount of road that we have to cover.
Well, I think, we're going to look, that's one of our topics actually next, to kind of look at these versus ongoing versus one time, and supposed to be looking at this every 4 years. I don't think anybody has. So we're going to be the first to kind of do that. And so I'm just kind of curious. I think there's other ways to maybe think about, ongoing and one time type things, but okay. I think Representative Baker has a question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I was just wondering if you could briefly comment on slide number 9, which is the property tax part of it, because consistently I've looked over the last decade, and Sweetwater County has either been number 2 or number 3 regularly, depending upon the price of natural gas and whether or not Sublette County has been number 2 or number 3. But it really looks like Converse County is really making a lot of headway. And I just wonder if you could just comment as far as the burden of some of these larger counties that are paying this portion. And obviously the property tax portion of this is, is a large part of it. But can you comment about some of the burden that's being placed on some of the larger counties with particularly with this and how it is, the tier one is it's so disproportionate compared to the tier three. You commented briefly, but could you just expound a little bit more?
Go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, I don't know exactly where you want to go, but these assessed valuations are simply a function of what your county is made up of in terms of minerals, residential, ag, lands, and certainly that fluctuates. And that money does generally stay local, with the exception of, in some cases, the school districts that are recapture districts. These figures can swing quite significantly. You are seeing great changes in Converse County, not only with the mineral development that is happening there, but as well with the wind development that is taking place. Another great example that can show how it can go the other way is Johnson County. In the coal bed methane days, Johnson County had an assessed valuation of over $1 billion. And you look at this chart and they're down in the $350 million assessed valuation level. So it does change significantly. Sweetwater County can go through those fluctuations. Sweetwater County is one of those, if you go to connect this to direct distribution, is one of those counties that gets caught in a conundrum and actually lost under the Madden formula quite significantly. So I don't know the solution, but it is multifaceted, I believe.
Just a question, kind of, I think back to this, the Madden formula, direct distribution, and really that was a compromise on the, when we were multi-billionaires and we got rid of the tax on food. That was really, we said, local government said, how are we going to make this up? We'll take care of you. And as you mentioned, that used to be 250 million a biennium, and it's shrunk down now to this 105, and it's probably not going any higher, right, in the foreseeable future. And so trying to keep that bargain, on tax on food, on an exemption we gave. So my question that I just wrote down here, really, what can this legislature do to help local government? I mean, some states give local governments a little more home rule, a little more power. We've generally not done that, but I guess if there are some things we can work on, I know this committee, I think talked about making the fifth penny permanent, those kind of things. So I'd like to hear your thoughts, I guess, on that. Thank you.
First, if you want. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Again, for the record, David Fraser, Executive Director, Wyoming Associates of Municipalities. I appreciate the question, and one of the things that I wanted to point out, this I almost said this morning, today, is that we appreciate the tools you have given us, and as you mentioned, compared to other states, we don't have that many tools, but we appreciate the tools you have given us. And I think in the presentation, Mr. Riemann just went over it. There's a couple places where it highlights that we're making good use of the tools you've given us. For example, in the property tax on page 6, when you look at the average mills per county and the average mills per city, we're making, with a couple of notable exceptions, one of which was mentioned in Mr. Noble's report, we're making pretty good use of that tool. In sales and use tax on page 16, where it kind of shows who's doing the fifth penny, who's doing the sixth penny. And I'm with Mr. Riemann. We should probably refer to those as, it's going to get confusing down the road if we don't start referring to those as general and specific purpose. But, we're making use of those. And we appreciate the tool you just gave us with municipal option tax. We're hoping to make use of that. I'd say the first answer to the simple answer to the question would be, if you could give us more tools, we'd be happy to use them. Specifically, on behalf of my organization, we've been looking at exemptions, and I know one of the ideas that's floating around, it's certainly floating around our board and our membership, is the idea of putting some sunsets on the existing exemptions. You know, it's so tough when you go to talk about a specific exemption and should we get rid of that? Well, it's really hard to have that kind of discussion. We believe that by putting sunsets on the existing exemptions, and not all the same sunset, of course, but if you put various sunsets on them, then you would have the opposite of that conversation. Instead of a conversation about, you know, should we get rid of this exemption, it would be a conversation about should we renew this exemption. And there will be some that you'll want to renew. And in this past session, I gave some testimony about, you know, there are some exemptions that we think probably should go away. At the same time, we testified in this very past session, that we hoped you would keep the exemption on data centers, because we thought that was still providing a good economic development purpose. Again, because the exemptions are all kind of in perpetuity, and perpetuity is a long time, and things change. And even the one that we supported this time, in 10 years, 20 years, will we feel that that's still providing you know, the right economic development incentive? We may not. So I think specifically that would be one thing that we'd like to see this legislature entertain, is taking a look at those sunsets. And that would give you an opportunity bit by bit to examine each of those, but in a positive rather than a negative way.
No, we talked this morning about how our economy's changed and how, what we spend our money on, you know. What, I mean, you could maybe do the same kind of thing, you know, a sunrise.
Yeah.
So to speak, on services, you know, so we're more like these other non-income tax states, because we don't want an income tax, right? We don't want that. But we got to keep that sales tax that we instituted in the 20s. Got to keep it modern. I mean, people buy different stuff. So anyway, I guess I answered my own. But you talked about exemptions. I didn't hear about services. That was.
Well, services, Mr. Chairman, would certainly be included in the statement that I just made. And again, same thing. There'll be some services that are probably worth
Right.
exempting. But as you pointed out earlier in this hearing and several other occasions, the nature of our spending has changed. And we are a service-heavy economy, much more than in the past, where we were a goods-heavy economy. And so I think we miss an opportunity if we don't look at that. And along with that, another thing I wanted to make sure I mentioned is that we appreciate you looking this in the face. You know, we're in the ground is changing beneath our feet, and it's not a comfortable conversation.
Mhm.
And you guys probably have some difficult decisions ahead of you, and so I appreciate today that you're looking it squarely in the face, and so I thank you for that, and I thank you in advance for the difficult decisions that lie ahead.
Question. Mr. Vice Chair Henderson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to talk about economic development. You mentioned economic development incentives a couple of times. So, you know, we have this economic development penny option. And I think there's only one county maybe that's used it. So if it's not being used, is that a basis for getting rid of it? Or should we have another look at it in terms of clarifying, you know, how it fits in with the rest of the overall package in terms of sunsetting and timing and so on. And particularly, I'm interested in knowing your perspective of what role the county commissions play in economic development.
Go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, as I noted, there are now 2 counties that are using the economic development fractional penny. Goshen County has had that for a number of years and has continued to support it. I believe they're assessing a quarter of a penny in that particular case. Fremont County became the second just this last November to institute it at a half penny. What I will say is that it's not that counties don't want to use these pennies. A number of counties have put economic development proposals up Campbell County is a more recent example that did just that. But you have to remember, all of these pennies are dependent on the voters. And in most cases, the voters have rejected that. And as I mentioned, no county has ever gone above 6 pennies. A number of counties have attempted to go past that. Commissioners have proposed that with their local government or their other local governments in the community. So it's not a matter of whether the commissioners are interested in trying to do that. It's up to the voters at the end of the day when it comes to these local options.
You have a follow-up there, Mr. Fraser?
Yeah, if I could add to that, Mr. Chairman, thank you. That's very well said, Jeremiah. And I think that I think it would be appropriate to give a little more authority to the local decision makers. You know, they, as you are answerable to their constituents, and in all of these cases with the extra pennies, you know, all the local elected officials can do is ask the voters, and I'm not in any kind of proponent that they would ignore the voters, but I think it would be good in some cases if they were given the ability of the local governing bodies to make some more decisions on that.
Okay, any other questions? Dr. Hallinan?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Riemann, I wonder if you'd give us your thoughts on the issue of the special districts. In Campbell County, we have a special district for the cemeteries, and they have about $20 million saved up. Do you think that these special districts need to be looked at for the amount of mill that they get? I've heard that there are some people on our county commission that want to lower this special districts percentage. Is this something that is possibly going throughout the state, that they're spending more money on these special districts than they should? And would that not be a source of income for the county government? Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, thank you. Go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Hallinan, I don't know that it's a source of revenue for my county officials on behalf of the county. But as it relates to special districts, it is a very contentious issue amongst county commissioners. Quite often, you know, there are a variety of different frustrations, whether that's the administrative and fiscal risk that counties are put at with some of these special districts. Some of it gets to the heart of what you're talking about in terms of their ability to tax, and some special districts are required to come before the county commissioners to approve their mill levy, to approve their budget, but that's not universal. In fact, I would suggest for most of them, it's not something that happens. So they're really outside of the control of any oversight once they've been approved, and that creates a lot of consternation in my membership. And it is something that we've supported evaluation of it. As Senator Case mentioned, it's a sticky wicket and can get messy, and it has been evaluated. Perhaps not enough has been done, though.
Okay, I think Representative Jennings. That's a question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Raymond, so before lunch, we received testimony, I think from our staff, that had done a bunch of this analysis on economic development. And I would have thought everybody on this committee would perked up their ears, and they were saying that economic development, that a lot of times we're spending money to bring economic development, but then it's costing us more money than what we're receiving. So could you give us your thoughts on that, either one or both of you? I mean, because that kind of seems like that's maybe going the wrong direction there. Could one of you guys?
You know, about that economic development that's been out there. Yeah, any comments on that?
Yeah, thank you through the chair. Thank you, Representative Jennings. You know, that's a tough ball game, and it's an important one because, you know, economic development is important to us. It does bring money, but you do need to be careful the way you set the tools up so that you're not spending more than it's worth to get that. And the example that I just used of the data center exemption, I think is a good example. I think right now that is providing the incentive that we need it to. I think it will have a limited effective life. And one of the reasons why I think it along with the other exemptions should be examined every once in a while. So I think number one, you need to be careful with how you develop the tools. And then secondly, at all levels of government, we need to be careful how we use them, that we make sure that we are getting a net benefit from them. And again, where it's not always, this morning was given some examples of other industries where it wasn't more than paying for itself. We just need to make sure that it does. But I don't think that means we throw the baby out with the bathwater. There are good economic development tools we need to keep in the toolbox.
Mr. Chairman, if I
Sure,
could.
go ahead.
Representative Jennings, it's important data. And in fact, if I put on an old hat from my career and go back to my Endow days, if you go into that report, we talk about this. And in fact, we talk about the fact that you have to change Wyoming's tax structure in order to develop or to benefit from economic diversification and development. And so something does have to change. Otherwise, you do end up in this cycle of adding cost to Wyoming's economy. And so it is an important piece. But I want to just say one other thing, and I'm not speaking for the commissioners now, I'm speaking for myself. The question is, do we want to wait until Wyoming's tax structure to provide opportunities for our youth, for our children, for our future? And for me, the answer is no. I want my children to have the opportunity to stay here in Wyoming if they so choose, and work in the industry, create the opportunity that they want to. And if that comes at a cost for the state, so be it. That was the choice of the legislature, not my children. And so I do think we have to think about these things a little bit differently. But yes, I mean, going back to my Endow days, you have to change Wyoming's tax structure or you're just adding costs.
Okay, anyone? You have a follow-up? Go ahead.
I do, Mr. Chairman. So, Mr. Reamy, I think everybody probably in the room would agree that we want our children to come here and live here, stay here. But for me personally, and I won't speak for anyone else, I look at some of that as a question of government picking winners and losers. And so I guess my question was more directed at the issue of, now we're getting data. We all want good data. And then the data is showing that we've spent lots of money on economic development, but we're actually not receiving the returns on that money. And so somewhere along the line, there's got to be some accountability that says there's got to be a better mechanism, either how we pick winners or losers, or maybe we get out of the picking winners and losers and just work on an environment that entices people to come. So I guess I'm just editorializing, but that was really what I was more directing at, is if we've been using this and we've done this, and it clearly is showing that we're not making the money at it, then perhaps it's time to look at some other ways of accountability.
Yeah, I think Representative Roscoe, did you have a question?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Fraser, Mr. Jeremiah, just because we were talking about food tax a little while ago and difficult conversations and tools that you guys need. I was just wondering if there's any way, the numbers I've heard are staggering of what that could produce. And I think Mr. McLaren back row there at one time gave us what the food tax would generate in Teton County. And I think I was just wondering if there's any way we could get some numbers on that for this on the statewide issue, and maybe how it could be distributed equitably. I think that might change the conversation and the arguments or the debate we have on helping the less fortunate because I think that could be taken care of. That's kind of a wild question, but thank you.
Mr. Chairman, my understanding, and the Department of Revenue put out data on this for the committee last year, is that the food tax, if it was assessed, would generate just over $60 million. If you think about that, if you assess that, you could take local government off of direct distribution and still have a little bit left over, perhaps for the general fund. I believe it's an annual number. You could take us off of direct distribution, still have money left over for food insecurity issues, whatever that might be, back to the general fund and cover at least the existing distribution for direct distribution.
Okay, Senator Schuler has a question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to piggyback on that same question. My understanding, and I don't have the history behind it, but I'd like to know maybe if you have the history behind it. When that exemption was put on the groceries, the idea, I think, was that if things got tough at the state level, that would go away. And again, I don't know the history behind it, but could you elaborate on that just a little bit?
Go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, I don't have that entire history other than that the state would attempt to make local governments whole.
No, that's the history. I mean, we were multi-billionaires. So I don't know, when was that? 05 or 06. So, okay,
Mr. Chairman,
go ahead, Representative Sweeney.
thank you, Mr. Chairman. So going to the direct distribution, if that were to go away, with or without the food tax, I guess I'm curious what your thoughts, because there may come a time when the state just can't hold its end of the bargain up any further. Any thoughts on that, if that came about?
Go ahead.
Thank you. Through the chairman, thank you, Mr. Sweeney. We, as you've heard me say a lot of times, and as well as my colleague, the direct distribution is a lifeline for many of our communities, particularly our smaller communities. And we appreciate what the state did when they, when they gave the exemption on the groceries, and they said they'd keep us whole. And again, that the goalposts have moved a little bit there, but you have been continuing to do that. I think it's, I think as part of this discussion, we need to figure out something that's going to be more reliable source of revenue for local governments. Frankly, we don't love coming here every 2 years and, and asking for that to be renewed. You guys, I know, don't love the discussion. And it's getting, it's going to get harder and harder. Well, it appears that it's going to get harder. We're all hoping for a miracle, I guess, but it appears that that's going to get harder for you to do, not easier. So I think part of this discussion really needs to be what would be a reliable source of local government revenue to replace that. Because again, if you just wanted to take it away, and boy, that would really, really devastate a large number of our communities. I think I just, is it 34 of our communities are under 500 people, and about 2/3 of our cities are under 1,000. So, when I'm talking about the small communities that are so dependent on it, I'm talking about most of our communities.
Right, for sure. And mainly what they sell is food and don't collect any tax off it.
Mr. Chairman, if I
Yeah, go ahead.
can add to it. First off, yeah, I mean, if I had one priority for this interim with you, it's to find a solution to remove us off of direct distribution. It would be important for all the reasons that Mr. Frazier has said, and I've presented to this committee options, and I think it is a multifaceted option in order to ensure that all counties, all municipalities are covered in that equation. And I'm happy to bring that presentation back to the committee if you'd like it. I just wanted to give a little bit of context and character to what the lack of direct distribution would mean for one county in particular. And I could give you others, but let's just take Washakie County. If they were to lose direct distribution next year, that would be more than 17% of their entire budget. If they were to lose payment in lieu of taxes or PILT along with that, which it's never guaranteed. In fact, it is still up for debate about whether it will be renewed. That's another 17% of their budget. That's more than a third of their entire budget is dependent on those two revenue sources in particular. And it's on a $6 million budget for all the things that they're doing for law enforcement and roads and all the other services that they're responsible for. So it would be devastating to many of our counties, our municipalities, if they lost direct distribution. Do I have a couple of members that would be able to weather it rather well? Yeah. I mean, let's, Sublette County gets, I think, about $6,000 out of direct distribution. They're very thankful for it and appreciative for it, but it's not to the level that some of our other governments rely on these sources of revenue.
Mr. Chairman, could I just have a quick, so thank you for both of those examples. And two communities, well, one that I represent, Tom Walters represents the other, Midwest and Edgerton. Edgerton would absolutely be devastated without direct distribution. I think it's maybe $35,000, but I mean, it's probably half their budget. I don't know. But anyway, I had been told that WHAM and county commissioners may have some sort of a conceptual idea on the food tax where maybe it's a lesser percentage, maybe 2.5%. It goes back to the counties. The county would then distribute because Casper, where I come from, holds all the grocery stores. And so how then does it get back distributed to Edgerton, Midwest, Mills, bar none? So is there anything that the two organizations potentially worked on?
Mr. Chairman, I've as I do with lots of different scenarios, play around with, okay, how could you do away with direct distribution and take care of local government? And so one of the concepts that I have played with is, I'm trying to find, okay, what is a piece of an equation that might get us to the amount that we need, which is roughly $52.5 million if we keep it at the current level per year. And if I'm right, the grocery tax, if it was instituted, would bring in just over $60 million in that. So yeah, I've played around with these scenarios. I've shared them with Mr. Frazier about the grocery tax. The thing about the grocery tax, though, is if you're looking at it as a replacement for direct distribution, you can't think about it in the way that you do the current distribution of sales and use tax, because the vast majority of that would go to municipalities, because that's where grocery stores are. And so it wouldn't really help counties. So you have to think about it in a different way. And maybe the different way is to, rather than distribute it under the existing formula, you distribute it under a Madden formula or some modified version of that. And then, yeah, you can gain back direct distribution to the Legislative Stabilization Reserve account, help us, at least cover the current approach that we have in place. And then you still have some left over, which, if you wanted to apply, because again, trying to think about all the arguments that I hear for why you don't put a grocery tax in. Put some money aside for, addressing those issues with, food needs in our communities so that we can ensure that the neediest have resources. I leave that up to you. I've got the presentation. I'm happy to come back and show you different options. I'm not necessarily, some of my members would say, don't do that one or, do that one. I'm just trying to help the conversation.
Right. And I think, our budget deal, we've done this with obviously the lodging tax, we got tourism out of the budget. Local governments get out of the budget, YDOT, FMR under the cap, they need about 20 million of that 60 million a year they get to run their non-construction stuff. So those are some big ones right there, would help our general fund immensely. And we've done one piece of that with with the lodging tax. So we'll keep working on it, but I appreciate that. And is there any other questions in Representative Baker?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just briefly, would either of you be willing to comment on the assessment and valuation of ag land? Because a lot of our rural counties, they have a lot of ag land. And I just would wonder if you have an opinion on that.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Baker, the only thing I can say to that is that when the bill was considered by the committee a couple of years ago, and as it was introduced, I believe, by the Farm Bureau, my members were interested in looking at that and seeing if it was worth pursuing. I don't know that we ever took a final vote because you all, it may have died before it got to our members, but it is at least something to look at.
Okay. Any other questions? Okay, we really appreciate the presentation. A lot of good information, and so we're going to continue learning. I think we're going to take a short break. It's 2:50, so we'll come back at 5 minutes after 3. Okay, thank you.
5:15. So we'll wait a couple more minutes for committee members, but. Maybe. I want to wait for the co-chairman because this is actually his baby. I never looked at the law for 4 years, and he did and said, we're supposed to be doing this. So we live on YouTube? Okay. Here he comes now. I do have an announcement. It turns out that Sweelers is closed Sunday and Monday, Representative Sweeney. But Sweelers, this is not a paid announcement, is back open. It's fabulous. They're doing a great job. And it's a new generation taking over. So don't forget Sweelers, but not tonight. All right. Mr. Co-Chairman, this is your baby. This is all because you went and read the law and stuck it to us. So the next one is the distribution revenue streams review as required by statute. And Dean, I turn it to you.
Thank you, Chairman Case. Thank you, Chairman Harshman, members of the committee. Again, my name is Dean Temte. I'm work for the budget fiscal section of the Legislative Service Office. Okay. Is this better? Okay. Okay. And I'm here to talk about the review that's required in Wyoming Statute 28-1-118 of state revenue distributions. Slide 2 talks about the requirements described in that particular statute, and the specific review of revenue distribution formulas for severance taxes, federal mineral royalties, and inheritance taxes. And actually, this particular statute came into existence. It was part of 2001 legislation, Senate File 9, which was de-earmarking legislation. And that statutory language added, it said the Joint Revenue Interim Committee shall submit a report to the governor and legislature by December 1, 2004, and by December 1 of each fourth year thereafter, reviewing the distribution formula for federal mineral royalties, severance taxes, and inheritance taxes. The report shall indicate whether the formula are understandable to public policymakers, serve the needs of the citizens of the state, and whether the distinction between sustainable revenues and one-time revenues contained therein is reasonable. The report may contain recommendations for legislation. The first distribution I will talk about today is the current severance tax distribution on slide 4. This particular severance tax distribution is described in Wyoming Statute Title 39-14-801. And in that particular statute, it describes how the constitutional 1.5% of the taxable value of all oil, natural gas, and coal produced in the state is to be distributed to the Permanent Wyoming Mineral Trust Fund. And this was added to the Constitution, I believe, in 1974. Am I right about that, Josh? Okay, thank you. That statute goes on to say all other severance taxes are distributed to what's called the severance tax distribution account. From there, before further distribution from that account, an amount equal to the 1 cent fuel tax is distributed to LUST accounts. LUST stands for Leaking Underground Storage Tank accounts. These were accounts that the legislature created. That they're actually the exact names of these accounts are the Corrective Action Account, created in Wyoming Statute 35-11-1424, and the Environmental Pollution Financial Responsibility Account, created in Wyoming Statute 35-11-1427. The funds to those accounts are distributed to the solid waste landfill remediation account and the orphan site remediation account. That's where the corrective action account funds are distributed to. The funds in the environmental pollution financial responsibility account, they provide financial assurance coverage for underground and above ground storage tanks. And they compensate third parties for damages caused by releases from those tanks. And the funds in the LUST accounts are specifically administered by the Department of Environmental Quality. The severance tax distribution statute goes on to say before further distribution from the severance tax distribution account, an amount equal to, let's see. Oh, sorry, I got a little crosswise there. Already talked about the funds that are distributed to the LUST accounts. And there's also an additional 1% of taxable value of oil and natural gas and coal is distributed to permanent savings. That statute was actually put into place in 2005. The sponsor of that particular piece of legislation, 2005 Senate File 25, was the late John Schiffer, who is actually a chairman of this particular committee. And it was also co-sponsored in the House by the late Representative Frank Phil. I'm sure there are several of you who may remember those two gentlemen. And
Representative Phelps served from Fremont County. So,
yes, Mr. Chairman.
mhm.
That additional and that additional 1% of the taxable value, that's become a pretty current topic of conversation for the legislature. It was referred to quite a bit in this past 2021 session. From 2005 until 2016, those funds were strictly distributed to the Permanent Mineral Trust Fund. That's how the statute read that was passed in 2005. Since 2016, that 1% severance tax has been diverted several times. The 1% severance tax has been diverted to the general fund. It was diverted to the general fund in the second half of fiscal year 16 and in fiscal years 2019 and 20. The additional 1% was distributed to what was created in the budget called the 1% severance tax account in fiscal years 2017-18 and fiscal years 2021 and 22. The ultimate distribution of the severance taxes to the 1% account in fiscal years 2021 and 22 was modified in this year's Senate File 121, in which those funds, the 1% severance tax, will be distributed, if I remember right, I believe it's 50% to the Permanent Mineral Trust Fund and 50% to the Common School Permanent Land Fund for the periods fiscal years 2023 to 2028. After fiscal year 2028, the additional 1% will be distributed 2/3 to the Permanent Mineral Trust Fund and 1/3 to the Common School Permanent Land Fund. So the bottom line for the 1% severance tax, predominantly it has been distributed to permanent savings. As I had mentioned, for the first 10 years of its existence, the first 10 years of that particular distribution, all of it went to the Permanent Mineral Trust Fund, but was diverted as I had described in the past few years. And beginning in fiscal year 23, those funds will continue to be distributed to permanent savings. However, a portion of it going to the Common School Permanent Land Fund rather than exclusively going to the Permanent Mineral Trust Fund. After those distributions of the funds to the Lust accounts and the 1% severance tax, the funds in the severance tax distribution account are distributed up to $155 million each fiscal year to 9 different accounts or entities. You can see the majority of it, or more than the majority of it, 62.26% of the first 155 million distributed from the severance tax distribution account goes to the general fund. A total of 15.05% are distributed to water accounts 1, 2, and 3. There's a separate distribution to each one of those accounts in a specific percentage, and I can look those up for you if you'd like me to tell you what those are. 4.33% is distributed to the highway fund, and 18.36% is distributed to, there's a distribution directly to cities and towns. There are distributions directly to counties, and there's also distribution to, let's see, there's a distribution to an account that goes specifically for state aid to county roads. And there's also a distribution to a local government capital construction account, which I believe that local government capital construction account helps fund the SLIB grants that that the legislature appropriates to the Office of State Lands and Investments for the SLIB board to approve those grants to local governments. In FY 2023 and thereafter, just distributions to the severance tax distribution account in excess of $155 million are distributed 1/3 to the general fund and 2/3 to the budget reserve account. And actually in the 2020, I say that distribution is in FY 23 and thereafter because the 2020 budget actually included a diversion of over the cap severance taxes. In the 2020 budget, section 314, in fiscal year 2021, amounts to the severance tax distribution account over 352.7 million up to 452.7 million are supposed to be distributed 1/2 to the budget reserve account and 1/2 to the school foundation program reserve account. In FY 22, there's a similar distribution like that, amounts to the severance tax distribution account over 366.05 million up to 466.05 million are also distributed 1/2 to the budget reserve account and 1/2 to the school foundation program account. However, based on the current consensus revenue estimating group forecast, nothing is forecasted to be distributed in those particular tiers. And just to let you know, I mean, this distribution on its face, it does sound somewhat complicated. To simplify it a little bit in terms of what the pie chart might look like, the amounts going to the Permanent Mineral Trust Fund will approximate between 23 and 24% in fiscal years 20 and 21. The amounts to the 1% severance tax account will approximate approximately 15.5% of the total severance tax distribution. Let's see, the amounts to the general fund will total 44.2% in fiscal year 20 and 30.8% in fiscal year 21. Recall in fiscal year 2020, actually the 1% severance tax account was distributed to the general fund. 23.4% approximately to the permanent mineral trust fund in fiscal years 20 and 21. And that's 23.4% of the total severance tax distribution.
Better use your microphone. We've got people online wondering what's going on.
Mr. Chairman,
Go ahead.
sorry. 23.4% per mill trust fund, 14% to the opposite.
Actually, that amount, the 1% severance tax account is estimated to receive a total distribution of approximately 15.5% of the total. The combined two of those accounts to the permanent mill trust fund and to the 1%, which after beginning in fiscal year 2000, well, actually even beginning in fiscal years 21 and 22, will also be distributed to permanent accounts. The total of that permanent mill trust fund distribution and the 1% distribution is around 39% per year. So almost 4/10 of the total severance tax is ending up in permanent savings based on the current distribution.
Mr. Chairman.
Go ahead.
And finally, Mr. Chairman, did you say 24% to the general fund? Was that your last number you said?
Let's see. I said the amount to the general fund in fiscal year 20 was 44.2%. And in fiscal year 21, it's 30.8%. And again, the reason that goes down is the 1% went to the general fund in fiscal year 20, but does not in fiscal year 21. The remaining distributions are actually pretty small under the cap. The total that goes to all three water accounts is roughly 4.7%, around 5% of the total severance tax distributed goes to the water accounts. Around 1.5% ends up getting distributed to the highway fund. And between roughly 6 and 7% ends up getting distributed to the local government accounts. And these amounts can vary a little bit depending on the total amount of severance taxes distributed in a current year. If the total severance tax distribution begins to decrease, then the under the cap amount percentages increase a little bit. Moving to the over the cap distributions, the budget reserve account for fiscal year 20 is anticipated to receive about 18.7% of the total in fiscal year 20 and 14% of the total in fiscal year 21. Again, that amount goes down because the budget reserve account only receives distributions over the severance tax distribution cap. In fiscal year 21, the amount of severance taxes over the distribution cap decreases quite a bit because severance tax revenues are projected to go down quite a bit. So that budget reserve account distribution will be a smaller percentage in fiscal year 21. Lots of times the general fund and budget reserve account distributions are kind of discussed in the same context. Both of those funds are used to basically fund general government operations. In fiscal year 20, the grand total that will be distributed to the general fund and budget reserve combined will be 62.9%. That was the amount for fiscal year 20, and in fiscal year 21, the amount is projected to be 44.9%. And again, one reason that number goes down is because of the 1% severance tax was distributed to the general fund in fiscal year 20, but not in fiscal year 21. And I know I've thrown a lot of numbers at you.
You kind of have, Dean. Would you mind talking about the way the fuel tax interrelated with the severance distribution?
Yes, Mr. Chairman. The amount that is distributed to the leaking underground storage tank accounts or the LUST accounts is actually an amount equal to the 1 cent, 1 cent of the fuel tax, known as the lust penny. And actually, the lust penny, I believe, is a fuel tax without exemptions. So that amount tends to be a little bit higher than the normal fuel tax per penny figure, which is estimated, which is between $6.5 and $7 million per year, where the lust penny is more in the ballpark of, well, in fiscal year 21, it's projected to be $8.5 million. And then in fiscal years 22 through 26, in the $10.4 to $10.8 million range. But again, that severance tax is distributed to those lust accounts, and it's equal to the amount of the 1 cent lust fuel tax penny.
Any other questions on this page?
Yeah.
Representative Gray.
Thanks, Chair. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Temte, I'm curious on the legislative history on the 1% severance tax. I'm just really interested in that. So what was the reasoning behind it at the time? I guess you said at the start it was immediately diverted into permanent savings, but I know you've got a lot of history. So, and what's the year on it?
Go ahead, Dean.
As I had mentioned, the 1% severance tax was put into this particular Wyoming statute in the 2005 session, Senate File 25. That was the bill sponsored by the late Senator John Schiffer and the late Representative Frank Philp. And the idea, again, was just to put more money into permanent savings, realizing, just trying to expand upon the concept of the Permanent Mineral Trust Fund to start with, that minerals will not last in this state forever. And the idea is to build the Permanent Mineral Trust Fund up to a point where the investment income from it can help fund state government operations to a greater extent.
Go ahead. I remember the buttons. 4x10.
Mr. Chairman, I think though, and Representative Gray, and I think your question, how I heard your question, that 1% though has been around since the 70s. I mean, it wasn't in the initial, we added to the severance, but it wasn't just added in 2005. That 1% has had that switch turned on and off out of permanent savings and out of use in the general fund. And so there was a time where it was saved, then it wasn't, but these were all mainly, I think the statute said we're going to spend it always. But then there was, I think over time in the 80s, some in the 90s, budget amendments that would save it permanently, then would tick off and it would be spent. And then this switched that. Now it's permanently saved, but we've used budget amendments to notwithstand it the last 4 years to create the opposite account. And put it in the general fund, I think one of these last couple of years to actually spend it. So it's kind of gone back and forth. So
go ahead, Representative Gray.
Yeah, I would like to ask Chairman Harshman a question on that. Not trying to put you on the spot, but so as your understanding is that in the 70s, it was originally conceived to be used, to be expended.
No, I think we could go back and probably learn a lot more about, the severance on coal at one point was 13%. There was an impact severance that went away. Coal's still at 7%.
It's a capital facilities tax on coal.
Impact tax with it. And so that thing has moved around a little bit over time. I think all the info is out there, and all the current 6 on oil, 7 on coal didn't come at once. First it was a severance tax, and then a year and a half later, I think was the 1.5% to the permanent fund. And then it took off from there a little bit, and it's been at this 6 and 7% on coal for a long time now. But I do think that 1%, it's always been in play, whether how much to save, how much to spend. That's just been the eternal debate. Will continue to be, I think, for today's children and tomorrow's children, right?
So the argument. Okay, we good on this one? Dean, are you going to move on to the next slide?
Yes, Mr. Chairman. Slides 5 and 6, these are basically just the severance tax distributions. This is table 4 of the current January 2021 Craig forecast. And then the following page is actually just showing more years of history.
When you say following, you mean page 6? Slide 6?
Yes, slide 5 is actually table 4 of the current Craig forecast, but slide 6 is just showing an expanded history. Slide 5 is just showing the history from fiscal year 2001 to 2020, where slide 6 is showing that severance tax distribution history back to fiscal year 1980. And this slide is good at just showing the amount of total severance taxes distributed over time. I mean, back in the 80s, in fiscal year 1980, the total amount distributed in severance taxes was $105 million.
Everybody take a look at these numbers in the total column. And just for example, see just over 100 million to begin with. It peaked in 2007, if I'm not, actually peaked in 2009 at almost 1.1 billion. And now we're below half of that. Have I got that right?
Mr. Chairman, yes, you do. That peak was in fiscal year 2000.
It's hard to go across, but it's roughly,
My eyes aren't what they used to be, Mr. Chairman.
looks like it might be 8.
Fiscal year 2008 was the high water mark.
Okay, now
That's
let's,
nearly $1.1 billion, and fiscal year 21 is projected at $405.7 million.
so just take a deep breath on that. These are real numbers. They're nominal numbers. I mean, they're not adjusted for inflation.
That is correct, Mr. Chairman.
So these are the actual tax revenues from severance. And it shows that what's happening to us is not a new thing. It's been in play for 10 years, a little bit more than 10 years. And what you'll look at when you see why it's in play, you'll find that, yes, there's a coal story there, but coal is not the only story. Natural gas's story is about the same decline. And frankly, oil's not doing that great. So this kind of comes back to, is this volatility or is this a structural change? And I just put that out for you.
And Chairman Case, I think part of the story in fiscal year 2008, that was the point in time where I believe that perhaps could have been the same year where the number of surface tons of coal produced hit an all-time high.
I think it was 454 million tons or something like that.
And this information, another table you can look at in the Craig forecast as well. Table 4 shows the distribution by account, where table 6 shows the distribution by mineral. And in that particular year, you can see that many of the minerals were quite high. I mean, oil, gas, and coal, really all three of them were doing well in that year.
Okay. Any questions? Keep going, Dean. You're doing a great job.
Okay. Mr. Chairman, I'm now on slide 7, describing the current federal mineral royalty distribution. Wyoming share of federal mineral royalties is distributed by the state treasurer's office in accordance with Wyoming statute 9-4-601. There is a distribution cap for federal mineral royalties as well of $200 million. The first $200 million is distributed to 7 different entities, and with a 1% of that $200 million deposited to the state general fund for administration. 44.8% of the first $200 million in federal mineral royalties is distributed to the school foundation program account. A total of 30.375% is distributed to the highway fund. A total of 13.125% is distributed to cities and towns and to the local government capital construction account. That was the account I mentioned in the severance tax distribution, which funds the grants from the State Loan and Investment Board. 6.5% is distributed to the University of Wyoming. 2.7% is distributed to the school capital construction account. And 2.25 is distributed to the highway fund specifically to be used for county roads. In fiscal years 23 and thereafter, FMRs, in addition to in excess of $200 million, are distributed 1/3 to the school foundation program account and 2/3 to the budget reserve account. And in 2019, there was legislation that passed which diverted the first $8 million that would otherwise be distributed to the budget reserve account to the University of Wyoming. And if I remember right, that was the 2019 legislation to, as Chairman Harshman just mentioned, to fund the new dorm program at the university. Similarly to severance taxes, in the 2020 budget, this time in section 315, a second cap was added. In fiscal year 2021, a second cap of $485.5 million was added. And in fiscal year 2021, a second FMR cap of $500.8 million was added. If any, and that distribution, FMRs that exceed that those second caps that were established in the budget will be distributed 1/2 to the school foundation program and 1/2 to the budget reserve, just modifying that distribution slightly, distributing a little bit more money to fund the school foundation program. Again, that's a lot of percentages to kind of boil it down to what a pie chart might look like. In fiscal year 20, almost 38% of total Representative Gray, do you have a question?
Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Representative.
Okay. Let's see, the largest percentage of the distribution of FMRs goes to the school foundation program. That both the under the cap amount and the over the cap amount were almost 38% in fiscal year 20, and a little bit over 39% is projected in fiscal year 2021. Another significant distribution of federal mineral royalties is to the budget reserve account. 37.7% of the total FMRs in fiscal year 20 went to the budget reserve account. In fiscal year 21, that number is going to drop to 27.9%, just because the projections for federal mineral royalties decreased quite a bit from the actual fiscal year 20 to the projected fiscal year 2021. And to get a really kind of 30,000-foot level look between the school foundation program and the budget reserve account in fiscal year 20, those two accounts received about 75% of the total federal mineral royalties distributed. And that amount drops to roughly 2/3 in fiscal years 2021. I mentioned the additional caps which were added in the budget, in the 2020 budget. However, based at the current Craig forecast levels, it's forecasted that the FMRs will not exceed that second cap in either fiscal year 21 or fiscal year 22.
Questions? Go ahead. Well, I got Mr. Co-Chairman, and then I'll get you, Representative Gray. I heard him first. Go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, is that, I'm looking on your slide deck and then I'm looking in the data book. So that there's a 9% for 9.3% for cities and towns. And then there's the city town CapCon at 3%.
Correct.
So how is that 9.375% cities and towns, 18.5 million? How is that distributed?
Back to you, Dean.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Chairman Harshman. I will try to remember. If I remember right, there is a flat distribution that goes to all cities and towns. And I think that flat distribution can vary a little bit depending on the size, depending on the population.
That has nothing to do with caps, right?
That is correct. This is a completely separate distribution under the cap.
Right.
So it's a distribution formula out there that's probably been around for a long time.
Yes, and I can.
I was just wanting to make sure it wasn't part of that funding of that mineral royalty grant.
No, it is
It's-
not. It is a
yeah.
direct distribution that goes
Yeah,
directly to all
direct
the cities and
distribution.
towns. And like I said, I believe there is a flat amount component and then distributed based on percentages, although I'm not remembering exactly how those percentages are derived. That'd be pretty easy for me to look up.
So
and send
in
that
your,
to you.
okay, Mr. Chairman, this is where I was confused. I think I understand it now. In your presentation there on slide 7, it says 13.125% to cities and towns. You're combining both those.
I am.
Okay,
I'm
which is,
adding a few of the
3.7
distributions
Capcom
together
and
to kind of summarize a
Ah,
little bit.
beautiful. Okay, I
So
got it.
All right.
Thank you.
I almost thought, I just have to break you guys up. It was a
No,
love
I-
fest there for
I
a
got
second.
it now. I'm a little slow on the uptake.
All right, let's go to Representative Gray.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I saw, Mr. Tempe, I saw the projection on the federal mineral royalties, on the next page. Is that been affected at all by the federal policy that has come down on the moratorium? Have you redone that projection or found the reason to? Thanks.
Mr. Chairman, I'm trying to remember if that, if the Craig forecast was, I believe the Craig forecast may have been released, the January Craig forecast may have been released before Inauguration Day. And that moratorium on new federal leases took place shortly thereafter. So these forecasted numbers, I don't believe they were adjusted based on that moratorium.
And I think the original moratorium thinking was like 60 days. But of course, we know that's not true, but I think they called it a pause. And we'll see how positive we are. So it doesn't account for that. So it could only potentially be worse at this point in time.
And Mr. Chairman, Representative Gray, it's my understanding that that only applies to the issuance of new leases as well. So that by itself would cause a little bit of a lag for that to really impact, because it did not impact current leases that were already approved, current drilling that is taking place, current mineral production that is taking place now on federal lands. You're talking about something that certainly could have an impact if it is in place for very long. But for one thing, it is not, these forecasted numbers do not reflect an adjustment for that.
Good. Anybody else? Keep going, Dean.
And that brought us to slide 8, which this is basically table 7A of the current Craig forecast. It shows the federal mineral royalty distribution history from fiscal years 2001 to 2020, and the forecast for fiscal years 21 through 26. The following page, slide 9, like the previous slide for severance taxes, is just showing a little bit more of the history back to fiscal year 2000 or 1980 through fiscal year 2020. And you can see back in the early 80s that the total distribution of federal mineral royalties was even under $200 million. That $200 million cap was added in the 1985 session. And I believe that was the first year where the total federal mineral royalty distribution exceeded $200 million.
And just in terms of broad trends for people that maybe aren't looking at these tables, they match the severance decline, peaking. They're all peak in 2008 and have declined by more than half since then.
Fiscal year 2008 was a big year, Mr. Chairman. Both total severance taxes and total federal mineral royalties both exceeded $1 billion by themselves.
Just tons of money.
And I think that you put them together and they don't add up to that, to $1 billion now.
Right. Volatility, structural change, you decide.
The next slide, on slide 10, it tries to describe how severance taxes used to be distributed prior to fiscal years 2002. Specifically, severance taxes, as Chairman Harshman has mentioned, the rates haven't always been 7% for coal, 6% for oil and gas. They varied quite a bit, as well as their distributions varied quite a bit. How the legislature would do it, they would add a 1% severance tax on coal and distribute it to water development account 1. And they would do the same thing with other percentages. They would do another percent and distribute it, like, for example, like to the highway fund or to the budget reserve account or to the various accounts, where each distribution to each specific account was a specific percentage of a severance tax on one of the minerals directed to a specific account. This method, while it created a specified revenue stream, resulted in a multitude of distribution methods that were specific to the particular mineral severance tax being distributed. It also resulted in severance tax distributions to specific accounts and entities which fluctuated with mineral prices and production levels. This next slide, slide 11, is a representation of what the old severance tax, the old law severance tax distribution used to look like. I believe it's been affectionately referred to as the spaghetti chart in the past, where you can see specific percentages of specific mineral production was distributed to specific accounts. And just in looking at them all together, it kind of looks like there's a lot of things going on at once, without regard to the total severance taxes that may be coming in for a year. It was specific to a mineral, and even more specific to the severance tax rate from that mineral.
We used to call this the spider web.
Slide 12 is describing the de-earmarking process. And I was not around for that. I started like the July after all of this was done.
You dog.
In July 2001. So Chairman Case, I believe you were here for all of de-earmarking. So please correct me if I misspeak about anything I'm going to say.
Well, Dean, all we need to know is it was supposed to be, we had lots of money. Money looked like it was increasing, so we were trying to simplify it and prevent some runaway receipts of money. And I think you have to agree, we simplified it a lot, right? Totally? I don't think so, but
Well, and actually, I would say in the research that I did based on how and when this happened, the de-earmarking process,
started,
it looked like it started in the 1999 budget bill, in section 335, created the Joint Legislative Executive Committee on State Government Expenditures and Revenues.
I was on that.
Because there was a forecasted shortfall of $183 million for the 2001, 2002 biennium.
Coal bed methane, by the time this was implemented, we had coal bed methane.
Correct. I mean, this all started, the de-earmarking process happened really before a lot of things in the mineral industry, specifically the gas industry, really started taking off. One of the recommendations of that Joint Legislative Executive Committee on Government Expenditures and Revenues was to remove the earmarked severance taxes to specific accounts. And there was a bill sponsored from that 1999 revenue expenditure study. There was a bill sponsored by the good representative, Dr. Tipton, which was mentioned earlier today. He sponsored 2000 House Bill 195, de-earmarking of state revenues. And this bill modified the severance tax distributions, and it was attempting to do it in a 2-year process. That bill passed during the 2000 legislative session. However, it did not go into effect. The effective date was July 1, 2001, which would have been after the 2001 legislative session. But that initial 2000 House Bill 95, it modified the severance tax distributions. It was the legislation that created the initial severance tax distribution cap. And the distribution started to take shape how it looked like, as I described previously. Also in that 2000 House Bill 195, it created the Select De-earmarking Committee, which then did additional work on the severance taxes and federal mineral royalties distribution. And the Select De-earmarking Committee sponsored 2001 Senate File 9, which was basically the de-earmarking legislation that put the severance taxes and federal mineral royalty distributions in place that we see today.
Wow.
And also this 2001 Senate File 9, that was also the bill that put the review of the distribution formulas in statute.
And nobody's read it till now, and Representative Harshman actually read it. Wow.
And in that de-earmarking legislation, I'm on slide 12. As I mentioned, that the legislature went through the process of revising both the severance tax and federal mineral royalty distribution statutes, and this process was referred to as de-earmarking. The federal mineral royalty distribution did change. However, it did not change as drastically as the severance tax distribution did, because as I had mentioned, the federal mineral royalty distribution already had a $200 million distribution cap as part of the distribution process. But it modified it, but not as significantly as the severance tax distribution was modified. You look at slide 13, this is a picture of what the distribution of old law, federal mineral royalties was before de-earmarking. As it shows, there's a $200 million cap. And if you look, many of the entities all of the entities that receive federal mineral royalties now received federal mineral royalties then. under that $200 million cap. However, the over $200 million distribution was changed quite a bit, simplified quite a bit, actually. Under the old distribution, 25% of the over 200 was distributed exactly like the under the under $200 million distribution. There was a specific distribution to the University of Wyoming. However, the university only received those funds in years where it was determined that they needed additional funding to properly fund their bond payments.
So Dean, that's not automatic, 6.75% of the overage
Well, the 6 point,
to the university.
the 6.75 was earmarked, if you will, for the university. But if it turned out that the University of Wyoming didn't need that funding to be financially sound on their bond payments and things like that, those funds would ultimately be distributed to the
Legislative accounts.
legislative royalty impact assistance account. Another thing that the legislation did in de-earmarking as well is it eliminated a few of the old accounts, a few of the coffee cans, if you will. The legislative royalty impact assistance account was one of them. There was also an account called the statutory reserve account. And that existed in addition to the budget reserve account, which already existed at the same time too. So that was part of that de-earmarking legislation as well, as to eliminate a few of those particular accounts.
Coffee cans.
Mr. Chairman, if you go to slide 14, this is basically just the statutory, how the statute reads, 9-2-1014. This was also included in 2001 Senate File 9, where it said any state agency that receives federal mineral royalties or severance tax distributions may request additional funding from the budget reserve account. It even gave a way to determine that total amount available in the budget reserve account. As you all know, and actually this particular part of the law, which was added in 2001 Senate File 9, was really the beginning of the local government distribution, if you will. If you look at D, it says the governor shall include his recommendations for additional funding for state agencies and for local governments from the budget reserve account in his budget recommendations submitted under Wyoming statute 9-2-1013 to the legislature. As I'd mentioned, this language was really the language that started the concept of the local government distributions. The first year that the legislature appropriated money for distributions to local governments was in the 2004 legislative session. And it was mentioned earlier today that like the local government distribution and the food tax exemption were kind
connected
of together, and they really weren't. They were kind of two different issues happening a little bit at two different times. The food tax exemption actually took place in the 2006 budget. It was the final section 300 in the 2006 budget as well. And the food tax exemption was pioneered by Representative Ann Robinson
from Casper.
Casper.
Very diligently, she pounded on
I from the time that I started until that passed, that was her passion, as I recall, Mr. Chairman. But that was passed as part of the 2006 budget, the food tax exemption. So the concept of the local government distribution and the sales tax exemption really weren't walked together perhaps as closely as perhaps described earlier today.
So I think that's very accurate, Dean, but I do think there was a promise made to municipalities and local governments that we would try to figure out how to backfill it. And so we had the distribution under this Part D that was percolating along. And I think people were arguing that that was part of the backfill, but it was not connected. And you're exactly correct, because there was no way. In the end, we just looked and there's no way to figure out what the backfill for the food tax was.
And Mr. Chairman, you're exactly correct. That section 300 in the 2006 budget, it did include an appropriation to try to hold local governments harmless. And I can remember back in those days trying to work with, he was Administrator Dan Noble at the time. He was Administrator of the Excise Tax Division. And Dan and I used to work together, scratch our heads and say, Dan, how do we come up with what this number really is? And he would say, Dean, we don't collect that information, so we really don't know. And if I've misstated that, please correct me.
I think you picked a time when he's out of the room, which was perfect. And that's exactly right. It was, you could take last year's numbers and that was only good for last year. It wasn't even good for this year, but then to begin to move past that as local economies grew, there's no way you could figure out what it was. We're not talking about Dan Noble. Representative Baker.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. On that 2006 Section 300, you said there was an appropriation included. Could you tell me, do you remember where that was coming from, that appropriation?
I would have. My guess, it was either the general fund or the budget reserve account. And I don't remember exactly the amount. It was tens of millions of dollars. I can look that up and let you know.
Did you have a follow-up, Representative Baker? Mr. Co-Chairman.
So, thank you, Mr. Chairman. So the food tax exemption was passed in 06 in law in the budget session.
Yes.
Right. Yeah, I remember I was on revenue then. Rodney Anderson was passed 5-4 out of our committee to get to the floor of the House. That was, you said, 06 budget session. Wow.
And then after, I'm sorry to interrupt. Go ahead.
No, I was just trying to get, but I do recall, I mean, I know they weren't linked together, but that was part of the deal. How are you going to make this up? 50 million a year. And I know Director Noble's nodding his head, and that's really where we've come to this distribution piece. It's gone through a couple different, and then Madden made it famous, but it was much like school funding. Everybody get their sheet and you look how much is Lander getting, how much is Evanston getting. And there was always just work going on it. And now we've kind of settled on that.
And Mr. Chairman.
Dean, go ahead.
And sorry about that, Chairman Case. It's my recollection as well. In the local government distribution used to always be in the budget. And I can remember years after 2006 where there were components of that specific direct distribution saying, okay, this is to offset the decrease for the food tax exemption.
So the words were there.
The words were there.
They were kind of meaningless.
Whether, but. And as far as the estimates for the food tax exemption now, and I'll depend on Director Noble to correct me if I'm wrong now, but I think those estimates are largely based on South Dakota sales and use tax numbers. Is that
Nodding.
correct?
Yeah, he's nodding. Okay, any other questions at this point? Keep going, Dean. You're almost home.
Okay. Mr. Chairman, that concludes my discussion as far as severance taxes and federal mineral royalties. The last part of the discussion, and I think this is the last slide, has to do with Wyoming and Wyoming's inheritance tax. Wyoming's inheritance tax is codified in Wyoming statute 39-19-101 through 39-19-111. The first $10 million of the inheritance taxes collected per fiscal year are supposed to be distributed to the general fund, with annual amounts over 10 million per year distributed to the budget reserve account. Wyoming's current inheritance tax is defined in Wyoming statute 39-19-104 as the maximum state death tax credit allowed to a Wyoming estate as a credit against federal estate taxes under the laws of the United States. And this worked fine until 2001, where the federal estate tax credit for state level death taxes was repealed by federal legislation by the Economic Growth and Tax Relief Reconciliation Act of 2001, which phased out that federal credit for state level death taxes over a 3-year period.
So that means our tax went to zero.
Mr. Chairman, that is the short story of it. Since the credit was phased out, the credit was actually replaced by a deduction for state taxes instead. But since the credit was phased out, since the state death tax credit cannot apply to estates after December 31, 2004, Wyoming's current inheritance tax program has been effectively eliminated. And there's been less than $100,000 collected since fiscal year 2010. Now, there still is a federal estate tax. The top tax rate of that is 40%. There's a very large exclusion now for that. Estates at a level or valued at a level, there's an exclusion for estates of $11.7 million per person. And unused portions of that exclusion can be carried to a spousal estate, effectively making that exclusion $23.4 million per married couple. And just some basics behind the estate tax and the inheritance tax. The estate taxes are actually paid by the estate, where inheritance taxes are paid by the heirs of the estate. There are currently 12 states, or actually I should say there are 11 states in the District of Columbia that currently have an estate tax. There are 6 states that have, or actually 5 states that have an inheritance tax. The state of Maryland actually has both an estate and an inheritance tax, but they have their exclusions that offset each other to mitigate that tax in the state of Maryland. Interestingly enough, before that, that credit was repealed in that 2001 federal legislation, all 50 states had an estate or inheritance tax in place. And since that repeal of that estate tax credit, 30 states just did the same thing, or 29 other states did the same thing that Wyoming did, and just let their state tax go away. There were several states that repealed it outright. But right now, again, there's 17 states that have either one or the other or both in place right now.
So thank you. And just some torturous history. I don't remember if it was the 1993 fiscal crisis or the 1999 fiscal crisis, but it was, and I'm sure Dean knows maybe, but we actually ran out of money, and a person died in Jackson Hole, and their amount of estate tax that they paid, which was just it didn't cost them a dime because it was the offsetting amount from the federal taxes, which wasn't very much. It was like 1% or something. That provided us $20 to $30 million, as I remember, and that made the difference. It literally made the difference. How do you recall that story, Dee?
Mr. Chairman, I don't know if I recall the story, but I do recall a page in the Department of Revenue annual report, which shows there was $50 million in inheritance taxes collected in fiscal year 2000.
That would go with
So
that
maybe
crisis.
talking about the same.
Yeah, I think that's it. Dan's, was that pretty much that one person? One person, $50 million, and the deductible portion of the federal was like 1% or something? That was a whale of an estate.
Well, and in actuality, Mr. Chairman, the way that the federal estate tax was created by creating the credit
Right.
was in effect a way for the federal government to share their estate tax wealth with the states.
Mm-hmm.
Because without costing estates any more money at all.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why so many of the states actually put into place, made their tax equal to that credit at the federal level for state taxes. And sometimes that tax is referred to as a pickup tax, if you will. But it was honestly a way of revenue sharing by the federal government with the states of the estate taxes. And I believe that was originally put into place as a way to somewhat equalize what the state inheritance and estate taxes look like, because there was quite a bit of variation in what those taxes might look like, and quite a bit of competition between the states on where they want the rich people to move, or states trying to attract wealthy people to move to their state. And that was one way they did that. And that credit put into federal legislation, that credit, it helped to kind of equalize that until it was repealed.
Okay, thank you. Pretty amazing. Now, I just would venture that the amount of wealth in Wyoming since then, it's become even more concentrated in a particular smaller amount of people, but larger amounts relatively. That's just a guess, but that would be my venture.
Mr. Chairman, that concludes my presentation. If there are any questions about this, I'd be happy to take them at this time.
Okay, Dr. Hallinan, you're lit up.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have a question on this Wyoming inheritance tax. How did they collect $100,000 since 2010 on this program?
Well, Mr. Chairman, Representative Hallinan, I will depend a lot on Dan Noble to correct me if I get this wrong. But it's my understanding that returns can be filed subsequent.
They're amending their earlier return.
Yeah, amending years up to 2004, or filing estate tax returns up to the estate year of 2004, when the tax was actually, and the credit was actually still in place.
So they filed an amended estate tax return that went back and picked up the amounts due under previous tax rates and previous distributions. So the money came in later, but it was really based on what they owed before.
Under those taxable tax years.
Anybody else? Anybody else on the Zoomer? Anybody else in the room? Committee heard the discussion on the distribution. This is a big deal, and I confess that we have not paid appropriate attention to it, but it's really a huge deal. Are all these flows of money still warranted as we thought they were 20 years ago? Are the needs there? Are the amounts there? Are the caps right? I mean, it is a huge undertaking. There's no science to it, but it's really, really important. And I do commend the co-chairman for thinking we need to dig into this, as this would be very painful. It's complicated, but boy, if there's ever some work that we probably need to do in terms of housekeeping, 20 years is a long time to go without looking at this. So what would be suggestions to move forward to keep looking at this? We just say, everything's good and we don't need to change anything, or should we drill down on it more? Mr. Co-Chairman.
Mr. Chairman, well, first of all, Dean, thanks for, it's incredible, really, this. And so I go back to the statute 28-1-118. So we're commanded to come up with a report by next December. And the report shall talk about whether it's understandable, serves the needs of the citizens, and whether that distinction between sustainable and one-time revenues contained is reasonable. So I don't know. I mean, sometimes when you do these things, Mr. Chairman, and you've got the most history of anybody, but it might be better maybe if we form a little subcommittee and just kind of dig into this a little bit with staff and then maybe come back so we're not burning a whole bunch of committee time. And then maybe have to go away and come back again and, through the interim, maybe a little bit and just work at this thing. Problem with changing these things, if you're going to take money from somebody, I mean, these become almost entitlements, local government sitting here, they're going to like, geez, what are you doing with that city county Capcom? You got school Capcom in there, you got all kinds of, then the general fund, it's a big recipient. So if we were going to come back with recommendations for changes to the law, is what the report says. So I don't know.
And Mr. Chairman, Mr. Co-Chair, this question does come up every once in a while, can we change the severance tax distribution? And the first thing Don Richards, my boss, and I tell people is there are always winners and losers when you do this. If someone gets more, someone also gets less. Changing the distribution does not increase revenues. It changes the distribution. And as you had mentioned, there are flows to the general fund and budget reserve, to state accounts. There are flows to local government accounts. There are flows to water accounts, to highway accounts. So that's kind of, remember that as we go through this process.
So, yeah.
I think Dr. Tipton, he was concerned that, and there were a lot of people at that time concerned that this was kind of an automatic pilot. And that the legislature was losing control of, and that amounts that were staying the same or growing under the formulas were not keeping up with the needs in all areas. And they were just moving off of our purview so that things were getting ignored. Some things were getting too much attention. And that was the purpose of the earmarking. I'm sitting here now and thinking, it doesn't seem like we de-earmarked much, really. It kind of feels like we didn't, but there was an amazing amount of money freed up that had been just going by formula to places. So back to you, Mr. Co-Chairman.
No, I agree everything that's been said, but I think we should still look at it. I think when the one doesn't serve the needs of our state, and I think we should take a look at it and what are the needs of our state right now, 2021. And so maybe a group of us can get together and start working on this report with staff and because our committee time, we got 6 days, you could burn a lot. You could burn 2 days on this. And I don't think we can kind of work independently for volunteer time, meet on the Zoom a little bit, work some ideas, and maybe it's nothing. And maybe we say it looks good, but come back to this bigger group with some ideas.
So what do you think? What do people think about that idea? It's better than dragging the whole committee through it, I think. And I've seen subcommittees work really well. Just come back to us with your ideas. So are there people that have a burning desire to do this? Representative Gray, we got Schuler, we got Hallinan, we got guys down there. How about if you take a list of these names and you develop like 5 total people? Is 5 about the right number?
Look at Josh. Yeah, probably.
There's nothing, there was something in our rules about subcommittees, but those were official subcommittees. This could be kind of an unofficial one. Josh, remind us. You just had to put the light on.
This would be probably more of a working group rather
Working
than a
group.
subcommittee because there's less
Restrictions.
restrictions there. So yeah, just a informal working group to look at this issue and dig deeper into it. And so totally up to you on the number of members, et cetera.
So is there any objection to having co-chairman Harshman lead this working group and maybe gather up those of you that are interested and probably have to limit the size, but is there any objection to that? Well, would somebody like to formalize that with a motion?
Mr. Chairman, so there's a couple of members of management council.
Hold it close to Representative Sini.
There was great discussion at management council, and I believe Chairman Greer got pretty upset during that, and perhaps
About what? What was he upset about?
I
Representative Yin, you're a management council guy. Big government and all. Come on.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I think the issue was that subcommittees are actually supposed to meet and then they get staffed by LSO. And so then they have to be recorded, et cetera. Working group has none of those restrictions. So just
So we'll call it a working group. Would you recommend that? Okay, let's call it a working group. So would the motion be to have a working group to look at this function? Who will make that motion? So we just get on paper, make that motion. Mr. Co-Chairman has made that motion. We do require seconds now, so I heard seconds from down there. All right, so that gives you a license to go hunting and only after we vote though. All in favor, say aye. Aye. Opposed, no. You have a license to put together 4 or 5 people, balance the 2 houses and go forward. Okay, all right.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Anything else? Mr. Noble, tell us where we messed up on this story.
Mr. Chairman, you were talking about the inheritance tax for the state of Wyoming, and
Right.
there were 2 reasons that there is now $100,000 worth of revenue out there. One of them is if there's an appeal filed before the tax court or anything like that on the federal level, we could be beneficiaries of that. And every once in a while, there is a little bit. But the other reason is because those statutes still exist on our books. And one of the functions is if you don't meet the criteria for filing a tax return with us, you have to file what they refer to as a no tax due certificate, and that costs $10. So we've been filing these wonderful little no tax due things for years. And there is obviously no tax due because there's nothing to tax. If anything, you might want to consider repealing the actual code section because quite frankly, all it does is create administrative issues. So just wanted you to be aware of it. That's why you're getting $100,000 out there. There's these wonderful little $10 returns that are coming in. And if anything, it doesn't probably even pay for the administration of it.
And aggravates a lot of our citizens in Wyoming.
I would imagine it probably does just that.
Yeah. Can we add that on the list to have a repealer for the next meeting on that? Yeah, go ahead. Yes.
I would move, Mr. Chairman, that we repeal that section of the code.
Okay. Have a bill drafted to do it. We'll have a
Bill draft to do that.
Okay, any further discussion? All those in favor, say aye. Opposed, no. We'll work it in maybe the next meeting. I'm not sure how the next meeting is going to play out in terms of it being in advance of the special session, but we will work that in into our schedule and make sure that it's properly noticed and people can weigh in. Anything else come before the committee today? I think we're good. Anything from the audience? Any public comment? Mr. Sniffen, welcome. We'll go to Zoom next. We're just taking out of order right now.
Excuse me, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. My name is Ron Sniffen. I am the Executive Director of the Wyoming Education Association. I want to thank you for all of your hard work. I appreciate the presentations today. I thought they did a really nice job of of setting the stage for a meaningful discussion about revenue. The WA appreciates how the legislature has made education a priority, and we certainly hope that you will continue to do so. Some of my takeaways from the presentation today, for example, the second lowest tax burden when you take away minerals in the nation. Economy of scale is always an issue. We're the most expensive when it comes to roads, medical, education. It's because we're a frontier state. There's the economy of scale. I thought the tax capacity report was fascinating. And Mr. Chairman, I think you've articulated as best as I've heard, do we have a volatility issue or a structural problem? And personally, I think we all know probably the answer to that after the presentations today. So Wyoming is at a crossroads, facing a failing economy that can no longer rely on the mineral industry. Legislators now must decide to either continue down the same path or make a hard turn to keep Wyoming operational by seeking new revenue streams. Few options remain for Wyoming to continue to provide essential services to students and the citizens of our state. Our state needs revenue. We're already pushed beyond the brink, especially every hospital, corrections facility, colleges across Wyoming are feeling the devastating effects that are serving the citizens. K-12 was spared massive cuts this last session, but the threat to our students and future remains. Having endured 131 million in cuts since 2017, the Wyoming education system simply cannot continue to do more with less. Insufficient streams of stable revenue to fund education all but guarantee without action, the students of 2024 will not be afforded the same educational opportunities as students today. Wyoming students need your help. Wyoming education is teetering on the cliff face. The WEA supports any efforts to increase revenue for the citizens and especially the students of the state. And I know we have heard during the last legislative session, many people outside of education who support funding for increased revenue, especially if it goes to education. I'm hoping you heard some of the same stories. And with that, I'll take any questions.
Okay, questions for Mr. Sniffen? Any questions? Thank you very much.
Mr. Chairman.
Who else would like to address the committee that are present today? I'm just looking in the room. I will get up on the Zoom in just a minute. Anybody else in the room? Okay. Is it Senator James?
Yes, Mr.
You
Chairman.
got it, Senator James.
I have a question for Mr. Steffen. I have a for Mr. Steffen.
Believe he was asked.
Yes, I was just curious if you had any solutions to bring to the table outside of any additional taxes or fees or anything like that.
Senator James, we need you to start over. This mic right here is on. Senator James, we need you to start over with your question. I'm just sorry, we're having audio problems in Riverton.
Okay. I was just curious if Mr. Steffen had any solutions to bring to the table outside of any taxes or fees.
Mr. Sniffen. And there you go.
Honestly, I don't, but I did hear earlier in a conversation about.
Turn it closer to you. It's just.
I don't specifically, but I do recall a reference to one of the Campbell decisions where the Supreme Court said you need to find revenue for education. It doesn't necessarily have to be taxes, but the state needs to find revenue from somewhere. So that's an excellent question, and I'll give it some more serious thought, sir.
Okay. Anything else? Anything
Yes,
else
Mr.
from
Chairman.
anybody else? Oh, wait, Senator James, I can see you're getting ready. Go ahead.
Yes, Mr. Chairman. We always hear WEA and other educational people come to the table with saying that we need to find the solutions, but this is a two-way conversation, and we would like to have some input from education on how to solve this situation. We agree that children are very important and education is extremely important to the future of of Wyoming, and they are vital. So we would like to have a complete conversation here on trying to solve this situation. So if you could actually come to the table with some solutions, that would be very nice. Thank you.
We'll do our best.
I think he answered that they'll do their best. Anybody else on Zoom land wishes to make a statement to the committee? We got anything that you guys see, the staff? Okay, going back to folks here, one last time, committee members, anything for the good of the order? Recall that there is a reception at the Riverton Country Club, sponsored by the Wyoming Realtors. Everybody's invited, including Wyoming PBS students and audio staff, everybody. So see you there if you're so inclined. All the lobbyists are invited too, and real people are invited if there's any around. With that, we'll stand adjourned till 8:30 tomorrow morning. We have a heavy lift tomorrow, but this day went well, and I really want to commend the staff and department and our local government partners for really an excellent day of education. I hope everybody got as much out of it as I did. Did a remarkable job. Thank you. All right, till tomorrow morning, right here. I think you can leave your stuff. Is that all right, John? You prefer not, really?